After a decorated career, he was looking forward to his golden years with his family.
He had recently retired.
They had a beautiful, smart daughter.
There was not a single person that had a bad thing to say about the two of them.
But a brutal crime destroyed everything they held dear.
There is blood splattered all over the walls.
The bodies had been there for several days.
I lost it. I totally became unglued.
Had young love proven to be fatal?
She had recently got her first boyfriend.
He couldn't stand it. He did not like it one bit.
Aaliyah.
He was very protective of her.
What's he doing here?
What is going on inside this family?
Or was the tragic truth almost too shocking to imagine?
Nobody wanted to believe it.
I was heartbroken. It is a pain that will never go away. He just didn't know that he was married to someone evil.
Put the gun down.
June 1st, 2012, San Diego, California. It's the start of another sunny weekend in this metropolis of 1.5 million.
San Diego is extremely gorgeous. There are a lot of beaches, great weather.
It's almost summer year-round, except for a little sprinkles of rain here and there.
But as the sun sets that Friday night, darkness consumes the home of 55-year-old Regina Johnson, her husband Ruben, and their teenage daughter, Aaliyah.
The police got a call to do a wellness check from Regina's sister. Regina and her sister traditionally spoke every day. That was their thing, to talk all the time.
She'd been trying to get a hold of Regina for a couple of days, had heard nothing, and so she was getting concerned.
When a patrol officer with the San Diego police arrives at the Johnsons' condo, nothing seems amiss.
Just because someone doesn't answer the phone doesn't mean that something's wrong. It could be as simple as a busy schedule, or maybe they went out of town and forgot to tell anyone about it.
San Diego Police Department!
After several attempts to make contact, the door finally opens.
Regina Johnson answered the door, and she didn't say a word.
You okay?
She left the door open and walked back into the living room.
And they're kind of scratching their head.
Ma'am, you all right?
The police tried to engage, but she was out of it.
She's like catatonic. Almost seems like she doesn't know where she is.
While Regina sits quietly on the couch, the officer does a preliminary sweep of the apartment. And down the hall, he makes a horrific discovery.
Just outside one of the bedrooms, officers found Ruben Johnson lying face up in a pool of blood. It was immediately obvious that he was dead.
When the officer turned toward the doorway where Ruben was lying, he discovered Aaliyah lying dead on the ground inside of her bedroom.
Originally from Lynchburg, Virginia, 56-year-old Ruben Johnson had always put family first.
He was fun. He was a jokester.
He was a loving brother. He light up the room, but he always had a smile on his face.
After graduating high school in the mid-70s, Ruben had spent 2 decades building a respectable career in the U.S. military.
He always had that discipline in him.
This is a man who wants things a certain way, very upstanding.
He stayed in there 20 years. It was a secure job. He didn't see no need to change careers.
And throughout his time in the service, his biggest support was his wife, Regina.
Regina met Ruben through his best friend, and they were introduced, and sparks flew.
They really seem to have a bond, a very strong, loving relationship.
They fell in love, they got married, they had Aaliyah, and Aaliyah became really the love of the life of both of them and just the focus of everything about the two of them.
But life in the military meant Ruben was often away from his wife and daughter.
He was continuously gone for 6 months at a time.
We're gonna miss you so much.
Promise. I'm gonna call every night, okay? You promise to be good?
Promise.
Take care of your mom for me, all right?
I will.
Since Ruben was away at sea so much, it was often just mother and daughter at home.
So if Aaliyah was doing an activity, Regina was going to be there. She would take her out shopping. She would go get manicures and pedicures with her.
Ever the military man, whenever Ruben was home from deployment, he always made sure Aaliyah stayed on course.
You getting your homework done, girl?
Yes, sir.
That's my girl.
She was a very smart girl, very smart. He wanted to see her graduate from school, go to college, get her degree.
A freshman in high school, Aaliyah appeared well on her way.
She was a cheerleader. She was a good student. The best way to describe her was just vivacious, vibrant. She radiated love and happiness.
Aaliyah was a sweetheart. She had so much potential, and she was a very smart girl. So she could have done anything she wanted to do.
Hey, babe, what are you up to?
She had recently got her first boyfriend.
His name was Xavier Marshall.
That time when it's puppy love and maybe your first love, you just want to be around that person.
I think it was an exciting time in her life.
Well, you know, I gotta get to soccer practice, but I'll text you later, okay?
Okay, yeah, call me.
All right.
Meanwhile, Aaliyah's parents were easing towards their golden years.
Ruben recently retired and obtained additional employment to help his family.
He was working as a security guard.
By all accounts, it looked like Ruben and Regina were really happy and they were moving forward in life.
But now, after a concerned call from Regina's sister, police have uncovered a gruesome scene inside the family's condo.
They found the bodies of Ruben and Aaliyah.
These bodies had been dead for quite a while.
And it appeared that they both been shot.
In San Diego, California, Ruben and Regina Johnson were looking forward to their golden years together.
Ruben had recently retired from the military.
Their daughter, Aaliyah, was in high school. She was flourishing.
But on June 1st, 2012, the family's condo has become the scene of a violent crime.
The family hadn't heard from Regina in about 3 days, so they alerted the police to do a wellness check.
They find Regina in a catatonic state. 2 bodies inside the condo.
Ruben and their daughter Aaliyah were both found dead from gunshot wounds.
The bodies had been there for several days.
It is unclear if there was an intruder, if this happened between the family.
Regina appears unable to provide the answer.
Regina is completely out of it. She's dazed, she seems confused.
Her husband is dead and her daughter is dead. Regina was probably out of her mind.
At this point, police didn't know if Regina had anything to do with the murders or if she was just a witness to a terrifying crime.
While Regina is transported to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, homicide detectives begin processing the crime scene.
Ruben's body was found outside of his daughter's door.
There are 2 gunshot wounds. One in his torso, one in the head.
Detectives find a cell phone on the floor near Ruben's body.
His cell phone is splattered with blood as well.
He had his earpiece in his ear.
In addition to the cell phone, investigators found a 9mm handgun on the floor next to his body.
Just outside of Aaliyah's bedroom, there was also a plate, a fork, a salad, and a half-eaten piece of pizza.
Aaliyah's body is face down a few feet away, just inside her bedroom door.
Aaliyah was found with a blanket over her body, and she was shot at close range to the back of the head.
She also was found next to a jar of petroleum jelly that was covered in blood.
Police believe she was holding it when she was shot.
More than likely, Aaliyah had no idea that she was about to be shot because it was done with her back turned, execution style.
Based upon the evidence, detectives reconstruct what might have happened.
They believe that Aaliyah was shot first. Ruben was shot second.
Maybe Ruben heard the shot and ran to his daughter's room to see what in the world was going on.
Instead, he found Aaliyah's killer waiting.
Ruben was shot in the torso, and then as Ruben is collapsing, he's shot in the head.
However, the theory leaves a few unanswered questions.
When detectives collected the gun from the scene, they were able to determine fairly quickly that the 9mm belonged to Ruben Johnson.
Ballistics confirmed this was the gun used to kill both Aaliyah and Ruben.
So how did the killer obtain the gun?
Detectives surmise that the killer has to be someone Aaliyah and her father knew.
There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing of value was stolen from the house. In fact, nothing was missing.
As shocking as it may be, detectives had to wonder if it was Regina Johnson who may have wielded the gun that killed both her daughter and husband.
While an officer keeps watch over Regina at the hospital, detectives begin knocking on her neighbors' doors.
They start to canvass the area and ask the neighbors if they heard anything, if they heard any gunshots, if they heard fighting.
Most of the neighbors said no, they had not heard anything.
They didn't hear a gunshot. They didn't even hear arguing.
Neighbors also describe Ruben and Regina's family in glowing terms.
By all accounts, Regina and Ruben had a solid, loving relationship.
Aaliyah was so loved by her family, her friends.
But one neighbor is able to offer information that piques detectives' interest.
One neighbor had heard Aaliyah and her father arguing several times.
What about?
Ruben wasn't crazy about her having a boyfriend. You know how fathers can be. He was protective of his little girl.
Ruben was unhappy about the amount of time Aaliyah was spending with Xavier, and it seemed that she was not focused on her studies.
He was afraid that Xavier would be a distraction because Aaliyah was seeing a lot of Xavier.
According to the neighbor, Ruben ended up putting his foot down.
He told Aaliyah that she couldn't see Xavier anymore.
Aaliyah had broken up with Xavier only 2 weeks earlier.
Could Xavier have sought revenge?
Detectives started to question whether the boyfriend could have had a motive to want to hurt Aaliyah and Ruben.
Put the gun down!
San Diego detectives investigating the murder of Ruben Johnson and his daughter Aaliyah have just learned that the teen had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Xavier Marshall.
There was a neighbor that mentioned there was a fight between Aaliyah and her father about her boyfriend.
The neighbor said Ruben had told Aaliyah not to see Xavier anymore, and she had subsequently ended their relationship.
Remember, Ruben was a military man, and rules were followed in his home.
Had Xavier sought revenge against Aaliyah and her dad after the breakup?
That could have created big problems.
Xavier could have been angry at both of them.
So at that point, the police wanted to speak with Xavier.
When Xavier's parents bring him into the station for questioning the following morning, nothing in the teen's demeanor suggests he could be a killer.
He was obviously distraught about what occurred.
still can't believe it.
When's the last time you spoke to her?
About 2 weeks ago.
He confirmed what the neighbors said. Aaliyah had broken up with him.
That make you mad?
Kind of.
However, he says he would never hurt Aaliyah.
She didn't want to break up. It was her dad.
She did disclose to her boyfriend that her dad was a little concerned about the attention she was showing to Xavier.
According to Xavier, Aaliyah had also revealed other concerning details about her home life.
Aaliyah started telling him that Regina was acting strange.
Aaliyah made it sound like her mom was depressed, I guess.
Aaliyah said she's staying in bed and that she's not really being as active.
She was home all the time, and she was crying a lot.
Aaliyah had even mentioned that at some point she got a little scared that her mom seemed suicidal.
You should know, I don't think her mom was just a danger to herself.
What do you mean?
And then, as Xavier tells police that he did hear Regina say that she was going to kill Ruben.
They asked him why. Why would she want to do that? And as a teenager, he answered like most teenagers.
I don't know. I tried to stay out of it.
Police didn't know what to believe. There didn't seem to be any motive for Regina to want to hurt her family.
Is Xavier attempting to take the pressure off of himself?
When's the last time you saw Leah?
Tuesday at school. We have class together.
Have you been to her house in the last few days?
No. Her dad didn't want me coming around.
Following up with Xavier's parents, they corroborate his alibi.
His parents verified that he was at soccer practice, and they were very adamant that our son could not have done such a thing like this.
They said Xavier didn't even know how to shoot a gun, let alone steal one and then shoot 2 people to death.
Okay, thanks.
After ruling out Xavier, detectives are more eager than ever to speak with Regina Johnson. And fortunately, they received word from doctors that her condition has improved.
It was necessary for police to really sit down and talk to her because she was the person found in the room with these 2 bodies.
Detectives head to the hospital to take an official statement from Regina.
She's starting to recover, although it is still obvious she's in a daze.
When she would talk about Aaliyah, she would get very upset and emotional.
When the conversation turns to Ruben, however, Regina's tone noticeably changes.
Regina had nothing nice to say about Ruben. She painted him as controlling, a tyrant, mean to Aaliyah.
He was just out of his mind about Aaliyah's boyfriend.
He couldn't stand him. He did not like it one bit. I mean, he's coming over there, going up in her bedroom and stuff.
They were just kids.
They definitely had different parenting styles.
Regina claims that on the morning of the murder, she had decided to let her daughter sleep in.
It was picture day that day, and Ruben left to go to a doctor's appointment, and she needed to get Aaliyah to school, I think it was by 10 o'clock in the morning, in order to get her there on time for the pictures.
Aaliyah, it's time to wake up, baby.
Regina says that Aaliyah was still getting ready when Ruben arrived home unexpectedly.
He wasn't supposed to be home till 11, but he came home before 10.
He was surprised to find that Aaliyah hadn't left for school.
Aaliyah, what are you doing here? Why are you in the school?
Ruben was incensed.
It became a yelling match.
Your priority is school.
That's where I'm about to go.
Regina hears arguing, so she runs up into the hallway.
What is going on in here?
You tell me what's going on.
She stepped in to calm the situation down.
He was just out of control.
But Regina claims that Ruben began directing his anger toward her.
Should be at school already.
Yelling so much.
Regina says her and Ruben get into this big argument.
She She told him right to his face, "I don't like you talking to our daughter like that."
I tried to stop it.
According to Regina, Aaliyah ran from the room and returned moments later with Ruben's gun.
She was tired of his rules, tired of his strictness.
But the retired military man reacted instinctively.
And then what happened?
I still can't believe you did it.
Regina states that it was Ruben who pulled the trigger.
Her daughter drops to the floor.
And then he dropped the gun.
Oh my God! What have you done?
She said that she grabbed the gun.
It just seemed to happen so fast.
Regina pulled the trigger and shot her husband.
Regina Johnson has just told detectives that she killed her husband, Ruben, after he killed their daughter, Aaliyah.
What have you done?
According to Regina, she grabbed the gun in anger and frustration and shot Ruben herself.
Aaliyah.
We knew that Ruben was extremely strict. We knew that there was a lot of tension surrounding how he was handling the situation with Aaliyah and Xavier. So Regina's story was not totally out of the picture.
If Regina was telling the truth, that would explain why she was acting the way she was and why she spent days inside the condo with the bodies.
She said that it was hard for her to say goodbye.
She said at one point she covered her daughter's body with a blanket and she laid next to her.
My baby. I just couldn't leave her. My baby, Aaliyah.
But there are some details about Regina's story that give detectives pause.
Ruben was shot twice.
She claimed that it was kind of self-defense because she thought he was going to go after her.
There are no shell casings on the floor, so they suspect that Regina might have tried to tidy up.
There's also the blood-spattered jar of petroleum jelly found next to Aaliyah's body.
The Vaseline jar had to have been in her hand when she was shot in order to get the kind of blood spatter that it had on it.
Which doesn't quite square with Regina's story about Aaliyah getting Ruben's gun.
And she never had an explanation for that. She said, "Oh, I don't know what that's about. You know, that was on the counter. I don't know why that's next to her. I don't know why there's blood on it."
Detectives also try to make sense of the half-eaten pizza and salad found on the floor near Ruben.
The police asked her, and she said, "Oh, I got that for Aaliyah. When Ruben came in during the fight, it got thrown."
Thank you for your time.
After talking to Regina, detectives reach out to Ruben's sisters, who were still reeling from the news of their brother and niece's deaths.
I didn't take it very well at all. I totally became unglued.
I was heartbroken. It is a pain that would never go away.
Ruben's sisters refused to believe Regina's version of events.
They were adamant. They said there was no way in hell that Ruben would do anything to hurt his daughter, let alone shoot her.
Even if the way she claims that Ruben killed Aaliyah, so I shot him, why did she call the police? You know, it makes no sense.
When detectives ask Ruben's sisters about his relationship with Aaliyah, they paint a very different picture than Regina.
We learned a lot through Ruben's family.
They admit he was strict, but nowhere near the tyrant that Regina made him out to be.
Don't get me wrong. He was strict on her and kept tabs on her, which he should have. He was just being a father. But Ruben wasn't abusive or anything.
He was worried about her. That's all.
My brother just wanted the best for her. That's all. Go to school, get your education, and make something of yourself. And that's all he wanted. So his daughter can turn out and be somebody.
According to Ruben's sister, Deborah, Regina took a different approach to raising their daughter.
She was a little bit lenient, and I know they didn't agree on that.
That really caused some conflict in the family.
But Ruben's sisters say that was hardly the couple's only conflict.
Regina spent a lot more than they made.
All she wanted to do was spend money, spend money, spend money.
When Regina lost her job earlier that year, the relationship had become even more strained.
Money was a little bit tight for them, and she was still doing those same things she was before with the spending and the shopping trips, and not really recognizing that they didn't have that kind of money anymore.
She pretended everything was okay.
But as Ruben's sisters made clear, that was far from the truth.
You could tell that there was problems. It had me disturbed and wondering what was really going on.
She was having these mood swings, erratic behavior, temper flares.
Regina was outgoing with family and friends, but all of a sudden, she started to pull away and literally lock herself in the home. She had really major challenges getting up out of bed. There were times she was in bed all day.
That strained her relationship with Aaliyah, and Aaliyah almost had to become a caretaker for her, and almost losing a little bit of herself because her mom was dragging her down.
Aaliyah's relationship with Xavier drove a further wedge between mother and daughter.
Watching your child transition into high school and having that kind of independence, maybe this was kind of distorting her thinking, that I'm losing my daughter, I've lost my husband, what else do I have?
Ruben's sisters say he tried to get Regina professional help.
Regina, you just gonna lay in bed all day?
He was really trying to get her medicated or even, potentially hospitalized because he was getting worried about her behaviors.
Things were bad. I said, Ruben, you really need to get out of there. And he told me he couldn't leave right then because Regina was sick.
He wanted her to get better. He wanted her to be okay. I don't think he wanted to be married to her anymore, but it didn't mean he didn't care.
At Ruben's urging, Regina had eventually sought help.
The medication she was taking and the therapy she was getting was supposed to make her feel better.
But now, Ruben's sisters are convinced that the interventions just weren't enough.
Ruben tried to make it work. He just didn't know that he was married to someone evil.
And when detectives receive the results of Ruben and Aaliyah's autopsies, it lends credence to what Ruben's sisters have told them.
The coroner found no gunshot residue on Ruben's hand.
He could not have killed Aaliyah.
Regina was responsible for the deaths of her husband and her daughter.
No, Regina, you're not thinking.
In San Diego, California, Regina Johnson has claimed that she shot her husband Ruben in retribution after he shot the couple's 14-year-old daughter, Aaliyah.
She said she shot him first in the stomach and then shot him again in the head because of fear of him maybe coming back to attack her or kill her.
But the autopsy results tell a different story.
The reports show that there was no gun residue on Ruben's hands.
The evidence showed he had been incapacitated after the first shot. He had fallen down. His head was right near the door. And similar to Aaliyah, it was an execution-style shot.
The forensic evidence from the crime scene further suggests that Regina was the sole shooter that morning.
Although Regina claimed that Ruben was the one to shoot Aaliyah, his prints were never found on the gun. However, Regina's prints were.
We found Regina's DNA on the slide that would pull it back. We found it on the grip where you would hold it. And then we also found her fingerprints on the magazine that the bullets were in.
Regina's prints on the magazine are incredibly significant. That means she loaded it. That means premeditation.
When detectives subpoena Ruben and Aaliyah's phone records, they cast even more doubt on Regina's story about that fateful Wednesday morning.
Regina said that all of this stuff happened before 10 a.m., before Aaliyah was going to school. However, when police pull the phone records, the phone record indicates Ruben was using his phone up to 11:30 a.m.
Aaliyah had stopped using her cell phone well before her father, ceasing all activity by around 8 a.m.
Aaliyah was a prolific texter, and her phone was completely silent that morning.
To detectives, that suggests that Aaliyah died several hours before her father.
Hoping to learn more about the timeline of events, detectives reach out to a friend of Ruben's who had been the last person to speak with him on the phone around 11:30 a.m. that fateful morning.
When detectives made contact with her, she was stunned to hear about what happened to Aaliyah and Ruben.
She says there were no problems that morning. Everything seemed to be fine.
He didn't seem upset. Nothing seemed out of order.
Yeah, no, I just came home real quick to make lunch.
She said he went home to make lunch, and that's where the salad and the pizza come from.
Pizza.
Once again, the forensics confirmed the friend's account.
When we did testing on it, it was Ruben's DNA on the fork. And so when we ended up looking at the timeline with the cell phone records, the more reasonable explanation for it was that Ruben had come home from his doctor's appointment, made himself some lunch, was going to his room, walked into Aaliyah's room, and then we think he saw her body and dropped it. One thing that Regina always described was that after Aaliyah was shot, that Ruben screamed out, "No, Aaliyah, no," and fell to the ground, reaching for her body. And I do think that probably happened as he saw the love of his life, his daughter, on the ground, shot in the back of the head.
Oh my God, Aaliyah, wake up!
And then he saw Regina with the gun.
You did this? Regina, no. No, Regina, you're not thinking straight right now, Regina.
It looked like he was backing up out of the room because he was kind of near the doorway when he was shot the first time. And then he fell to the ground and was executed.
What I will never know is how long did she wait between the time she fired the first bullet in him and the time she fired the final bullet in his head? And what did she say to him as he was laying there begging her for help, begging for his life? And I do believe he was begging for his life. He had to be, because he knew she was crazy.
Once it becomes clear that Ruben could not have been the killer, like Regina said, police arrest her and charge her with murder.
Ruben's family rejoices at the news.
I knew straight up Ruben didn't do it. I never believed it in the first place. Never at one point did I believe Ruben killed Aaliyah.
But those who know the couple refuse to believe that Regina could be a killer.
Nobody wanted to believe it. Nobody wanted to believe that Regina was capable of it. They all wanted desperately to believe her story because they had cared about her. And so it came as a huge shock for all of them.
Even if they believed that Regina had killed her husband and her daughter, many friends and neighbors say it had to be her mental illness to blame.
They'd seen her as a mother and they just could not fathom this happening. So we did have a lot of people trying to give her the benefit of the doubt.
The circumstances of Regina's mental illness also sways the court. And in a preliminary hearing, she's found unfit to stand trial for murder.
She was found not competent because of her depression.
Instead of a courtroom, she ended up in a psychiatric hospital.
I was disgusted. I mean, I couldn't wrap my head around that.
Depression does not constitute a reason to kill your family.
Would Regina ever see her day in court?
At this point, no one was sure if justice would be served for Aaliyah and Ruben.
Even though she's been charged with the double murder of her husband and daughter, it's beginning to appear unlikely that 55-year-old Regina Johnson will face justice.
A preliminary hearing had initially found her mentally incompetent to stand trial.
She did have to go to a mental hospital.
It's not until October of 2017, 5 years after the murders, that Regina finally goes on trial.
That had to be such a long and agonizing wait for Ruben's family.
Overall, it was the worst, just the worst time of my life. I can't describe it.
It was just Deborah and myself. We was holding each other up.
It was one of the most emotional trials I've ever done. And I think it was because it was just everybody cared so much about everybody involved in one way or another that there was just a lot of emotion going on in that courtroom. I had a lot of tension between Regina's side and Ruben's side.
Her family were there, her sister, her mother, and it's sad because the irony of it is at one point in time, yes, we had a good relationship. I had a good relationship with her family, but that's gone now.
Whatever feelings Ruben's sisters had for Regina are also long gone.
When I looked at her, all I saw was 2 empty eye sockets. No soul, no anything. Nothing, just emptiness. Empty eye sockets was what I was looking at.
The prosecutors opened by presenting their theory of what really happened to Aaliyah Johnson.
Ruben left the house at about 8 a.m.
Aaliyah took a shower that morning to get ready for school.
Aaliyah was getting ready for picture day. I do think there was truth to that.
Which also explains why the petroleum jelly was found by her body, because she had just got out of the shower.
Prosecutors aren't sure why Regina shot her daughter, but they have no doubt that she did.
Prosecutors don't need to prove motive. They just need to prove that Regina was responsible. And they argue that the evidence clearly proved that Regina had taken Ruben's gun and used it to kill her daughter.
Regina snuck up behind her and shot her execution style.
Leaving Aaliyah where she had fallen, Regina waited for Ruben to come home.
Ruben had been completely surprised to learn that Regina had killed their daughter, and he had zero time to react when she pointed the gun at him.
Regina, no. No, Regina, you're not thinking.
Prosecutors believe that Regina hadn't intended to stop at killing Ruben either.
So prosecutors thought that this was probably going to be a murder-suicide.
She was losing everything that she cared about, her job, her role as a mother, Aaliyah, Ruben. So we thought that the plan was, rather than lose everything, she would just kill her family and then kill herself.
But Regina had hesitated for 3 whole days.
Maybe she tried to get the courage to kill herself but couldn't. And that 3-day period was where she messed around with the evidence a little bit, came up with the story, and decided, what she was going to do.
When it's the defense's turn, their strategy takes everyone by surprise.
They never raised insanity as defense, and even during the trial, they did not offer her mental state as a defense.
Instead, the defense relies on Regina's testimony.
Regina finally takes the stand, and she gets up there and tells the same exact story that she told police the first time, verbatim.
She maintained vigorously that she did not shoot her daughter.
During cross-examination, however, Regina slips.
She breaks down and she blames her doctor, that her doctor was supposed to make her better, that her doctor didn't make her better.
She felt like if she had been treated properly for her depression, maybe she wouldn't have done this. It was the closest we ever got to an acknowledgement that it didn't actually go down the way that she had described.
When the case goes to the jury, it takes them 3 days to reach their verdict.
She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
I'm happy that she got what she got. She's locked up where she needs to be.
I felt relief. Did it give me satisfaction? No. Did I rejoice? No, because there's nothing to rejoice about.
He had some faults, but, everybody does, and he didn't deserve to get.
The winter of 1977 did not merely arrive in central Ohio. It settled like a suffocating shroud, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the skeletal remains of the oak trees and turned the slush in the gutters of Newark into jagged ribs of ice. It was a season that should have been defined by the warm glow of Christmas lights reflecting off the snow, the scent of pine needles, and the frantic, joyful bustle of last-minute shopping. Instead, a different kind of chill began to permeate the air, one that didn't come from the Arctic fronts sweeping across the Great Lakes. This was a coldness that lived in the shadows of alleyways and behind the flickering neon signs of roadside bars. It was the kind of cold that made a person look twice over their shoulder before unlocking their car door, a primal instinct whispering that something predatory was moving through the darkness. In the small, working-class communities that dotted the landscape between Columbus and Newark, the rhythm of life was predictable, dictated by the shift whistles of factories and the steady arrival of the morning mail. But that predictability was about to be shattered by a weapon so small it was almost toy-like, and a duo of killers whose most terrifying attribute was how perfectly they blended into the mundane scenery of Midwestern life. Gary Lewington was a man who understood the power of the inconspicuous. As a postal worker, his life was a series of routines, a man defined by the blue uniform and the satchel of letters he carried through the neighborhoods of Ohio. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War, a conflict that had taught him the mechanics of death and the hollow silence that follows a firefight. He had returned to the States with the ghosts of the jungle still clinging to his psyche, transitioning from a soldier to a man who sorted the correspondence of a world that seemed increasingly alien to him. His hands, the same hands that handled the intimate details of people's lives, their bills, their love letters, their condolences, were steady and calloused. Next to him sat his younger brother, Thaddeus, a man whose life was a crumbling monument to financial desperation and a lack of direction. Thaddeus was the jagged edge to Gary's calculated calm, a man drowning in debt and looking for a way to seize control of a world that was constantly slipping through his fingers. Together, they sat in the dim interior of a car, the heater struggling against the December frost, watching the entrance of a local tavern in Newark. They weren't looking for a fight or a confrontation. They were looking for an opportunity, a moment where the veil of civilization was thin enough to tear through. The target was Joyce Vermillion and Karen Dodrell, two women who had no reason to believe that their night out would be their last. They were just figures in the gloom, illuminated briefly by the swinging door of the bar, their laughter puffing into white clouds in the freezing air. To the Lewington brothers, they weren't people with families, histories, or futures. They were variables in a lethal equation. Gary reached into the glove box and pulled out a .22 caliber pistol. It was a light weapon, lacking the thunderous roar of a .45 or the intimidation of a shotgun. But Gary had modified it. Affixed to the barrel was a homemade silencer, a crude but effective piece of engineering designed to turn the violent expansion of gases into a muffled cough. This was the signature of the .22 caliber killers, a preference for the quiet, the intimate, and the absolute. They didn't want the spectacle of a Hollywood shootout. They wanted the efficiency of the slaughterhouse. As the women walked toward their vehicle, the crunch of their boots on the frozen gravel was the only sound in the parking lot. They didn't see the car door creep open. They didn't see the silhouette of a man stepping into the light of a distant street lamp. The first shot was not a bang, but a sharp, metallic snap, like a twig breaking in the dead of winter. It was a sound so insignificant that it might have been mistaken for a car backfiring blocks away or a heavy icicle falling from a gutter. But the effect was instantaneous. Joyce Vermillion crumpled, the life escaping her before her body even hit the ice. There was no time for a scream, no time for Karen Dodrell to process the nightmare unfolding beside her. The predatory efficiency Gary had honed in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia was now being applied to the quiet streets of his home state. He stepped closer, the muzzle of the .22 leveled with a terrifyingly steady hand. The second shot followed just as quickly as the first, then a third and a fourth. They were fired at point-blank range, aimed with surgical precision at the heads of the victims. This wasn't just about the robbery that would follow. This was about the absolute assurance of death. The .22 caliber round is small, but at close range, it doesn't just penetrate. It bounces within the skull, creating a chaotic path of destruction that leaves no room for survival. Gary stood over them for a heartbeat, the silence of the night rushing back and to fill the void left by the shots. He didn't feel a rush of adrenaline or the crushing weight of guilt. Instead, there was a cold, clinical satisfaction, a sense of power that he hadn't felt since he wore a rucksack and carried an M16. Thaddeus moved in then, his movements frantic and clumsy compared to his brother's. He reached into the pockets of the fallen women, his fingers numb from the cold and the burgeoning realization of what they had just done. He pulled out a few crumpled bills, a handful of change, and a purse. The take was pitiful, barely enough to cover a week's groceries or a few tanks of gas. To most, the risk would seem insane. The cost of 2 lives weighed against the price of a cheap dinner. But for the Lewington brothers, the money was merely a justification, a thin veneer of logic over a growing addiction to the act of killing itself. They retreated into the darkness of their car, the engine turning over with a low rumble as they slipped away from the scene, leaving 2 bodies to be discovered by the morning light, their blood blooming like dark, frozen flowers on the Ohio soil. As the sun rose over Newark the next day, the town woke up to a reality it wasn't prepared for. The news of the double homicide spread through the diners and the post offices like a cold front. People spoke in hushed tones about the execution-style killings, a phrase that felt too violent for their corner of the world. The police were baffled by the lack of witnesses and the absence of a struggle. There were no shell casings left behind. Gary was too careful for that, and the small entry wounds of the .22 caliber bullets offered little in the way of forensic clues. It was a ghost crime, committed by men who appeared to be ghosts themselves. This was the beginning of a year-long reign of terror that would see the Lewington brothers traverse the highways of Ohio, turning the state into a hunting ground. They would target the vulnerable, the isolated, and the unsuspecting, always using the same quiet weapon and the same devastating precision. The hook of this story isn't just the violence. It's the terrifying realization that the man delivering your mail or the neighbor struggling with his bills could be the architect of your demise. The psychological profile of the brothers began to diverge as the body count rose. While Thaddeus remained driven by the desperate need for cash to settle his mounting debts, Gary was descending into a darker space. The war had left him with a void that could only be filled by the exercise of ultimate authority over another human being. In the civilian world, he was a cog in a machine, a man whose existence was dictated by zip codes and delivery schedules. But with the .22 in his hand, he was a god. He decided who lived and who died in the span of a second. This god complex would eventually lead them to their most heinous act, the invasion of a family home during the most sacred time of the year. But in December 1977, as the police struggled to find a motive for the deaths of Joyce and Karen, the Lewington brothers were already cleaning their weapon, the oil on the cloth smelling of ozone and metal, as they planned their next move in a game that only they knew they were playing. The fear that gripped Ohio wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping rot. It started in Newark, then drifted toward Columbus and the surrounding suburbs. Every late-night gas station attendant started watching the door with a different kind of intensity. Every couple parked in a lover's lane felt the weight of the darkness pressing against the glass. The brothers were tapping into a deep-seated American anxiety, the fear that the stranger in the night isn't just a thief, but a nihilist. As we delve into the story of the Lewington brothers, we must look past the headlines and the court transcripts. We must imagine the silence of those winter nights, the sound of the .22's muffled snap, and the mundane mask of a postal worker that hid the face of a monster. This was a crime spree that challenged the very idea of safety in the heartland, proving that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like us. The stage was set for a year of blood, a year where the caliber of a bullet was small, but the shadow it cast over the state of Ohio was long, dark, and seemingly endless. As we move forward into the chilling details of their subsequent crimes, the investigation's failures, and the bizarre twist involving a false confession, remember that first night in Newark. Remember the cold, the silence, and the 2 women who were simply walking to their car. Their deaths were the opening notes of a macabre symphony, conducted by a man who had brought the war home with him and a brother who was all too willing to help him fight it. The .22 caliber killers were no longer just a rumor. They were a reality, a dark thread woven into the fabric of Ohio's history, waiting for the one mistake that would finally bring their reign of silence to a crashing, violent end. But before that end could come, more blood would have to be spilled, more families destroyed, and a whole state would have to learn what it truly meant to be afraid of the dark. The journey into the heart of the Loingdon brothers' darkness is not just a study of crime, but a descent into the fragile nature of our own security, where the line between a normal life and a horrific end is as thin as the barrel of a small-caliber pistol. The atmosphere in the Loingdon household during those early days of the spree was likely one of eerie normalcy. Imagine the clink of silverware during dinner, the flickering light of a television set broadcasting the news of the very murders they had committed, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of two men who felt no remorse. Gary probably went to work the next morning, sorting letters with the same methodical care as always, perhaps even nodding to the police officers who were scrambling to find the killer he saw in the mirror every day. Thaddeus likely paced his apartment, checking the few dollars they had stolen, the weight of his debt still pressing on him, yet bolstered by the newfound secret he shared with his older brother. This duality, the mundane and the monstrous, is what makes the Loingdon case so uniquely disturbing. They weren't hiding in a cabin in the woods. They were living in the house next door. And as the winter of 1977 bled into the new year, the brothers were just getting started, their appetite for the pop of the .22 growing with every sunset that disappeared behind the flat, gray horizon of the Ohio plains. To understand the bloodbath that would eventually claim 10 lives across the heart of the American Midwest, one must first understand the soil from which such violence grew. Ohio in the late 1970s was a state in the midst of a profound and painful transformation. The post-war industrial boom that had built the cities of Columbus, Newark, and Akron was beginning to shudder and crack under the weight of an emerging recession. The Great Lakes region was starting to be referred to as the Rust Belt, a term that carried the scent of oxidizing iron and the quiet desperation of thousands of men watching their livelihoods evaporate. In towns like Newark, the skyline was dominated by the smoke of factories that were slowly cooling, and the streets were lined with the modest, wood-framed houses of a working class that had always believed in the virtues of hard work and quiet lives. This was a landscape of gray skies, flat horizons, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the everyday. It was a place where people took pride in their invisibility, where being a good neighbor meant minding your own business and keeping your lawn trimmed. But beneath this veneer of Midwestern stoicism, the economic pressures of the era were creating fissures in the social fabric, and for two brothers, those fissures were about to become a gateway to something unspeakable. Gary Loingdon was the embodiment of this gray, unremarkable world. To his neighbors and co-workers, he was the man in the blue uniform, a reliable fixture of the United States Postal Service. There is a specific kind of trust we afford to those who handle our mail. They are the silent witnesses to our lives, the ones who know our names, our addresses, and the frequency of our correspondences without ever truly knowing us. Gary moved through the neighborhoods of Ohio with a practiced mechanical efficiency. He was a man of few words, his face often set in a neutral mask that betrayed nothing of the thoughts swirling behind his eyes. But this mask had been forged in a place far removed from the temperate climates of the Midwest. Years earlier, Gary had served in the humid, chaotic jungles of Vietnam. He was part of a generation of young men who had been plucked from their quiet lives and dropped into a meat grinder of unconventional warfare. In the jungle, Gary had learned that life was cheap and that the difference between a survivor and a casualty often came down to who could remain the most still, who could see without being seen, and who could strike with the most clinical detachment. He returned to Ohio not as a hero draped in glory, but as a man who had seen the abyss and brought a piece of it back home in his pocket. The transition from soldier to postal worker was a jarring descent into the mundane, a life of sorting zip codes and walking routes that must have felt like a slow death to a man who had once operated on the razor's edge of combat. While Gary was the silent architect, his younger brother Thaddeus was the catalyst of chaos. If Gary was defined by his discipline, Thaddeus was defined by his lack of it. He was a man who seemed to be constantly drowning in the shallow end of life. While the rest of the country was grappling with the energy crisis and skyrocketing inflation, Thaddeus was grappling with his own personal failures. He moved from job to job, never quite finding his footing, always looking for a shortcut that never materialized. By late 1977, his financial situation had moved from precarious to disastrous. He was haunted by debt collectors, his mailbox filled with the very types of past due notices that his brother Gary likely delivered to other desperate men every day. Thaddeus lived in a state of perpetual resentment, looking at the world around him not with a desire to join it, but with a burning need to take from it. He looked up to Gary, seeing in his older brother a strength and a darkness that he himself lacked. Gary was the veteran, the man who had seen things, and in Thaddeus's eyes, that military experience was a tool that could finally solve their problems. The bond between them was not one of brotherly affection in the traditional sense. It was a pact of mutual necessity, a dark synergy, where Gary's lethal skill set met Thaddeus's desperate greed. The setting of their early meetings was likely as unremarkable as the men themselves. They didn't huddle in secret bunkers or plot in darkened basements. Their conspiracy likely took shape over cheap coffee in wood-paneled kitchens or in the front seats of parked cars, the heater blowing stale air as they watched the world go by. They spoke about the unfairness of their lives, about the money that seemed to be everywhere but in their own pockets, and eventually, the conversation turned to the weapon. Gary possessed a .22 caliber Ruger pistol, a firearm often dismissed by serious shooters as a plinker or a tool for small game. But Gary knew better. He knew that the .22 was the preferred tool of professional assassins for a reason. It was light, it had almost no recoil, and most importantly, it was easy to silence. In a garage or a basement, Gary utilized his mechanical aptitude to craft a homemade suppressor. He wasn't looking for the sleek, Hollywood version of a silencer. He needed something functional, something that would turn the sharp crack of a gunshot into a dull thud that wouldn't alert the neighbors or the police patrolling the next block over. This weapon became the third member of their partnership, a quiet, unassuming killer that mirrored the men who held it. The geography of central Ohio played a crucial role in their ability to remain undetected. The region is a web of state routes and backroads that connect small clusters of civilization like Newark, Hebron, and the sprawling suburbs of Columbus. It is a place where you can be in a bustling shopping center one moment and on a lonely, unlit stretch of highway the next. This was the Lewingdons' hunting ground. They understood the rhythm of these roads, when the police shifts changed, which gas stations were staffed by lone attendants, and which bars had parking lots shrouded in shadows. They weren't looking for high-profile targets. They were looking for the easy mark, the person whose absence wouldn't be noticed for hours, or the small business where the security was nothing more than a rusted lock and a tired employee. They were predators who understood that the best way to avoid capture was to blend into the background radiation of everyday life. They were the two men in a sedan that you passed on the highway and forgot 3 seconds later. They were the shadows that moved just outside the circle of light at the edge of town. As 1977 drew to a close, the psychological climate of the brothers reached a tipping point. For Thaddeus, the pressure of his debts had become an agonizing physical weight. For Gary, the boredom of his civilian existence had become a different kind of agony. He missed the clarity of the mission, the way the world narrowed down to the sight picture of a weapon. The decision to begin their spree wasn't a sudden explosion of madness. It was a logical conclusion to a long process of dehumanization. They had stopped seeing the people of Ohio as fellow citizens and started seeing them as obstacles or opportunities. The first murders in Newark were a test run, a way to see if Gary's silencer worked and if Thaddeus had the stomach for the aftermath. When they slipped away from that first crime scene with a handful of blood-stained cash, they didn't feel the crushing weight of the law or the sting of conscience. They felt a profound sense of relief. They had finally found a way to exert control over a world that they felt had abandoned them. The era itself contributed to the slow realization of the threat. In the late 70s, police departments were not the interconnected, data-driven entities they are today. Information moved slowly, often hindered by jurisdictional boundaries and a lack of centralized forensic databases. A murder in one county was often treated as an isolated incident, even if it bore striking similarities to a crime in the next town over. The Lewingdons exploited this fragmentation. By moving between jurisdictions and choosing victims with no apparent connection to one another, they created a puzzle that no one was yet looking to solve. They were operating in the gaps between the law, moving through the gray spaces of a state that was too preoccupied with its own economic survival to notice the two brothers who had turned the backroads into a shooting gallery. The weather, too, was a silent accomplice. The brutal Ohio winters kept people indoors, muffled sounds, and turned every crime scene into a race against the falling snow that threatened to bury evidence before it could even be documented. To look at Gary and Thaddeus during this time is to see the banality of evil in its purest form. Gary continued to deliver the mail, his route taking him past the very houses where families were discussing the recent tragedies in the news. He might have even delivered the newspapers that carried the headlines about his own crimes. Thaddeus continued to fumble through his days, perhaps buying a pack of cigarettes with the change he had pulled from a dead woman's purse. There was no outward sign of their transformation. They didn't wear masks or leave cryptic notes. They simply existed, two unremarkable men in an unremarkable landscape, waiting for the sun to go down so they could reclaim the power that the daylight denied them. This was the setting, a perfect storm of economic decay, military-grade trauma, and a landscape that offered infinite places to hide in plain sight. It was an environment where the quietest weapon could cause the loudest silence, and where the most dangerous people were the ones you never bothered to look at twice. The psychological interplay between the brothers during these early stages was a delicate balance of power. Gary was the mentor, the one who provided the how and the where. He brought the cold, tactical mindset of a long-range reconnaissance patrol to the streets of Ohio. He taught Thaddeus how to approach a target, how to maintain situational awareness, and how to disappear into the darkness. Thaddeus, in turn, provided the why. His desperate need for validation and his constant financial crises kept the momentum going. He was the one who would suggest a new target when the money ran low, his greed acting as the fuel for Gary's lethal engine. They were trapped in a feedback loop of escalating violence, where each successful crime emboldened them to take greater risks. They weren't just killing for money anymore. They were killing to maintain the bond they had created, a brotherhood of blood that made them feel superior to the sheep they moved among during the day. As we moved deeper into the winter of 1977, the atmospheric tension of the story thickens. The air in central Ohio felt heavy, charged with an unspoken dread that seemed to cling to the frost on the windows. The Lewington brothers were no longer just men. They had become a phantom presence, a dark rumor whispered in the corners of bars and across the counters of late-night diners. They were the reason people started locking their doors in towns where keys had traditionally been left in the ignition. They were the reason the night felt a little longer, and the shadows a little deeper. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the quiet pop of the .22 was about to become the heartbeat of a state paralyzed by fear. The background of this case isn't just a list of dates and locations. It is a study in the erosion of the American dream and the terrifying ease with which the mundane can turn into the monstrous. The Lewingtons didn't come from another world. They were a product of this one, a dark reflection of the frustrations and failures of an era that had forgotten how to look after its own. And in that forgetfulness, a predator had been allowed to grow, undetected and unhindered, until the first drop of blood hit the ice in Newark. To truly understand the depth of the tragedy that began to unfold in the winter of 1977, one must step away from the cold forensics of the police reports and the sensationalized headlines of the era. One must look into the warm, lived-in spaces that these 10 individuals occupied before they were reduced to names on a ledger. Every person the Lewington brothers encountered was a world unto themselves, a complex tapestry of memories, unfulfilled dreams, and small, daily rituals that defined their humanity. When Gary and Thaddeus Lewington looked through their sights, they saw targets, but the communities of Newark and Columbus saw fathers, mothers, grandmothers, and friends. The story of the victims begins not with their deaths, but with the vibrant, mundane lives they were leading right up until the moment the darkness intervened. The first thread of this narrative belongs to Joyce Vermillion and Karen Dodrell. In the late 1970s, Newark was a place where friendships were forged in the shared rhythm of factory shifts and the communal warmth of local taverns. Joyce, 37, and Karen, 33, were inseparable, two women who navigated the challenges of working-class life with a shared sense of humor and a deep-seated loyalty to one another. On that fateful December night, they were simply looking for a brief reprieve from the biting Ohio cold. They were inside a local bar, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the jukebox hum of country music, laughing over drinks and planning for the upcoming holidays. Joyce was a woman who took pride in her family, a mother whose life revolved around the well-being of her children. Karen was known for her infectious energy, a person who could brighten a room with a single well-timed joke. When they stepped out into the freezing parking lot, they weren't thinking about mortality. They were likely discussing the frost on their windshields or the gifts they still needed to buy. They were walking toward their car, their silhouettes casting long shadows under the flickering amber streetlights, completely unaware that they were being watched by eyes that saw them only as a means to an end. Their deaths were a jagged tear in the fabric of Newark, leaving behind children who would grow up with a hollow space where a mother's voice should be, and a community that suddenly realized its porches were no longer safe. The tragedy reached its most agonizing peak exactly 1 year later, moving from the anonymous shadows of a parking lot into the hallowed sanctuary of the family home. The house on Nobixby Road was the kind of place that symbolized the American dream for a man like Robert Jackson. At 45, Robert was a man of steady habits and quiet strength. He was a dedicated employee at the Jeffrey Manufacturing Company, a man who believed in the value of an honest day's work and the sanctity of the home he had built for his family. Robert wasn't a man of grand gestures. His love was expressed in the way he meticulously maintained his property and the protective stance he took over his household. Beside him was his wife, Christine, a 40-year-old woman whose presence was the glue that held their world together. Christine was the heart of the home, a woman who found joy in the small details, the way the table was set for a holiday meal, the warmth of a fire in the hearth, the quiet conversations shared after the chores were done. She worked at a local department store, moving through her days with a grace and kindness that made her a favorite among both colleagues and customers. Residing with them was the matriarch of the family, Robert's mother, Beulah Jackson. At 77, Beulah was a living archive of Ohio history. She had lived through the Great Depression, seen the world transformed by wars and technology, and had reached an age where her greatest pleasure was watching the legacy of her family flourish. She was a woman of gentle wisdom, the kind of grandmother who remembered every birthday and whose kitchen always smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. As Christmas of 1978 approached, the Jackson home was a beacon of festive light. The tree was decorated, the pantry was stocked for the upcoming feast, and the air was thick with the anticipation of family gathering. On the evening the Loingdons arrived, the Jacksons were sitting at their dining table, perhaps discussing the weather or the final preparations for Christmas Day. They were in the most secure place they knew, surrounded by the people they loved most. The violation of that space, the sudden, violent intrusion of the brothers, did more than just end 3 lives. It shattered the collective sense of safety for every family in the region. The image of that dining table, with the remnants of a half-eaten meal and the festive decorations still in place, would become a haunting symbol of how quickly the mundane can be consumed by the monstrous. Beyond the Jacksons and the first 2 women in Newark, the Loingdons left a trail of victims who were often the unsung heroes of the night shift. These were the gas station attendants and store clerks who kept the world running while everyone else slept. Imagine a young man working the graveyard shift at a convenience store, the hum of the refrigerators the only company in the quiet hours of the morning. He is a student, perhaps, working to pay his way through college, or a father taking an extra shift to provide a better life for his kids. He counts the minutes until dawn, leaning over a textbook or a newspaper, his life ahead of him like an unwritten book. When the bell over the door rings, he looks up with a practiced smile, expecting a traveler in need of coffee or a local in search of cigarettes. He doesn't see a killer, he sees a customer. In the few seconds it takes for Gary Loingdon to raise the .22, that young man's entire future, the weddings he would attend, the children he would raise, the old age he would eventually earn, is extinguished. These victims were chosen for their vulnerability, for the fact that they were alone and working for a paycheck that barely covered their rent. To the Llewellyns, they were just obstacles in front of a cash register, but to their families, they were the center of the universe. There is a profound cruelty in the randomness of these selections. The victims didn't know the Llewellyns. There were no grievances to settle, no debts to collect, no past conflicts that led to these moments. The only thing they shared was the misfortune of being in the wrong place at a time when two men decided their lives were worth less than the paper money in their wallets. This lack of connection makes their stories even more heartbreaking. It highlights the fragility of the human condition, the way our lives are intertwined with the paths of strangers we will never truly know. Each victim was a unique individual with a specific way of laughing, a favorite song, and a list of things they planned to do the next day. Joyce and Karen were planning their futures. The Jacksons were celebrating their past. The store clerks were just trying to get through the night. All of them were robbed of the most basic human right, the right to grow old. The impact of their loss radiated outward like waves in a dark pond. In the aftermath of each shooting, there were the parents who had to bury their children, the husbands who returned to empty houses, and the children who would only know their parents through fading photographs and the stories of others. The grief was not just a personal burden for these families, it was a collective trauma for the state of Ohio. People began to look at their neighbors differently, wondering if the man delivering their mail or the person in the car next to them held the same darkness as the .22 caliber killers. The victim's story is a narrative of stolen potential. It is about the empty chairs at the Christmas dinner, the unfinished projects in the garage, and the silence that now hangs in the rooms where these people once lived and breathed. It is a reminder that in every true crime story, the most important voices are the ones that have been silenced. When we talk about Robert Jackson, we should remember the pride he took in his home. When we talk about Christine, we should remember the warmth of her smile. When we talk about Beulah, we should honor the decades of life she lived before it was cut short. We must remember that Joyce and Karen were more than just the first victims. They were pioneers of a friendship that deserved to last for decades. The store clerks were not just statistics of a robbery gone wrong. They were hardworking individuals whose lives had immense value. By focusing on the details of their lives, the texture of their sweaters, the dreams they whispered to themselves, the love they gave to their families, we pull them back from the edge of the abyss that the Llewellyns tried to push them into. We refuse to let their identities be defined solely by the violence that took them. The coldness of the Llewellyn brothers stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the lives they destroyed. Gary's calculated, military-style executions and Thaddeus's greedy desperation were an affront to the simple, decent lives of their victims. The brothers didn't just take lives. They attempted to erase the very concept of community and trust. Every shot fired from that silenced .22 was an attack on the idea that we can be safe in our homes and our neighborhoods. But in the end, the memory of the victims has outlasted the names of the killers. The stories of their lives continue to evoke a sense of empathy and a desire for justice, while the Llewellyns are remembered only for the hollow, senseless nature of their crimes. As we move into the darker chapters of the investigation and the eventual capture of the brothers, it is essential to keep the faces of these 10 people in the forefront of our minds. They are the reason the story matters. They are the light that the Llewellyns could not fully extinguish, even with their quiet, deadly weapon. In the quiet corners of Ohio, there are still people who remember the Jacksons' holiday lights or the way Joyce Vermillion would wave to her neighbors. These small memories are the true legacy of the victims. They represent the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love over hate. The tragedy of the .22 caliber killers is a story of profound loss, but it is also a story of the value of every single life. As a scriptwriter, my goal is to ensure that when the audience hears the story, they don't just feel the chill of the winter of 1977, they feel the warmth of the people who were lost. We owe it to them to tell their stories with the respect, depth, and humanity they were denied in their final moments. Only by understanding who they were can we truly appreciate the magnitude of what was taken from us all. Their lives were the heartbeat of Ohio, a steady, beautiful rhythm that was interrupted by a silence that never should have been allowed to fall. We listen now to that silence, and in it, we find the echoes of the lives that once were, and the lessons we must learn to ensure that such a darkness never finds its way into our homes again. The transition from desperate financial struggle to a systematic campaign of cold-blooded murder was not a sudden explosion of madness, but rather a calculated descent into a moral abyss. To understand the horror of what the Lewington brothers did, one must look at the incident not as a single event, but as a year-long rhythm of violence that pulsed through the heart of Ohio. It began with a test of nerves in the shadows of a parking lot and culminated in a domestic massacre that shattered the very definition of home. The horror lay in the silence. Gary Lewington, with the cold, tactical heart of a soldier who had seen the worst of humanity in the Vietnamese jungle, had engineered a way to kill without making a sound. The homemade silencer he had meticulously crafted and attached to his .22 caliber pistol was more than just a tool. It was a psychological shield. It allowed the brothers to operate in the spaces between heartbeats, to enter a world, extinguish a life, and vanish before the echoes of the act could even reach the ears of the public. The spree truly found its lethal momentum as the brothers realized just how easy it was to hunt. For Gary, it was a return to the mission. He wasn't a postal worker anymore when the sun went down. He was a phantom, moving with a predatory grace that his younger brother, Thaddeus, could only mimic with a clumsy, nervous energy. They would drive for hours, the interior of their car filled with the acrid scent of cheap cigarettes and the low hum of a radio, scanning the roadside for the right kind of vulnerability. They looked for the lonely fluorescent glow of an all-night gas station or the isolated silhouette of a tavern at closing time. The incident that truly defined their method involved the stalking of Joyce Vermillion and Karen Dodrell. It was a cold December night, the kind where the air feels like a blade against the skin. The brothers watched from the darkness of their vehicle, their breath misting against the glass. They saw the two women emerge from the warmth of the bar, their voices carried away by the wind. There was no argument, no provocation. Gary simply stepped out, the modified Ruger hidden against his leg. He didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He moved with the mechanical certainty of a man who had already decided that these two women were no longer human beings. The pop of the suppressed pistol was so quiet it was almost intimate, a sharp, metallic snap that was swallowed by the winter wind. The violence escalated from these random encounters to something much more terrifying, the violation of the sanctuary. The incident at the Jackson residence on No Bixby Road remains the most haunting chapter of their spree because it happened in the one place where every human being expects to be safe. It was December 1978, almost a year to the day after their first kill. The Jackson family was in the midst of their holiday preparations. Inside the house, the air was warm, smelling of pine and wood smoke. Robert Jackson, his wife Christine, and his elderly mother Beulah were gathered in the dining room, a space that represented decades of hard work and family loyalty. The brothers didn't break down the door with a thunderous crash. They slipped in, a shadow entering a house of light. When Robert Jackson looked up from his seat, he didn't see a monster from a movie. He saw a man in a coat, a man who looked like someone he might have passed on the street 1,000 times. The confusion in Robert's eyes lasted only a fraction of a second before Gary raised the weapon. The act of killing the Jacksons was an exercise in pure, unadulterated nihilism. Gary fired with a surgical precision that was horrifying to behold. He didn't spray the room with bullets in a fit of rage. He stood there, his feet planted, and delivered single, fatal rounds to the heads of his victims. The .22 caliber bullet, small and deceptively weak, is a devastating tool at close range. It enters the skull with a clean, almost surgical puncture, but once inside, it lacks the energy to exit, instead ricocheting off the interior bone like a pinball, shredding the brain in a chaotic, irreversible path. Robert fell first, his body slumping against the table where he had just been sharing a meal. Christine's scream was cut short by the same muffled snap. Then, the barrel turned towards 77-year-old Beulah. In that moment, any shred of humanity the brothers might have claimed was extinguished. To look into the eyes of an elderly woman who has just watched her son die and still pull the trigger requires a level of darkness that is difficult to comprehend. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, the only sound being the ticking of a clock and the heavy breathing of Thaddeus as he began to scavenge for money. They moved through the house with a chilling lack of urgency, stepping over the bodies to find a few $100s. This was the Luynden signature, a total lack of proportion between the value of a human life and the pittance they stole to justify the act. The spree continued with a series of convenience store robberies that felt more like executions than heists. These incidents followed a grim, repetitive pattern. A lone clerk, usually working the graveyard shift to support a family or put themselves through school, would be standing behind the counter, lost in the quiet boredom of the early morning hours. The bell would chime, a sound usually associated with a customer and a sale. But for the victims of the Luyndens, that bell was a death knell. The brothers would enter, and while Thaddeus played the role of the lookout, Gary would move to the counter. There would be no demand for money at first, no screaming of orders. Gary would simply wait for the clerk to look at him, to acknowledge his presence, and then he would fire. He wanted to see the moment the light went out. It was no longer about the money. The money was just a way to keep score. It was about the sensation of the trigger pull, the subtle recoil of the pistol, and the absolute silence that followed the pop. They were addicted to the power of erasure, the ability to turn a living, breathing person into a static object in the blink of an eye. The horror of these incidents was compounded by the fact that they were happening in plain sight. These weren't crimes committed in deep woods or hidden bunkers. They were happening on the very roads that the people of Ohio traveled every day. The gas stations where people fill their tanks, the stores where they bought their milk, the neighborhoods where they raised their children, all of it had been turned into a hunting ground. Each incident left behind a wake of devastation that went far beyond the physical evidence. At each scene, the police would find the same chilling lack of struggle. The victims were often found exactly where they had been standing, their bodies having simply collapsed as if their strings had been cut. There were no shell casings, no fingerprints, no signs of a fight. Just the heavy, oppressive silence of a room where a life had been taken by a ghost. The Luynden brothers were perfecting the art of the vanishing act, leaving the authorities to chase shadows while they returned to their normal lives, Gary to his mail route and Thaddeus to his quiet, desperate brooding. Psychologically, the incidents revealed a disturbing synergy between the two men. Gary was the engine of the violence, the one who possessed the technical skill and the emotional vacuum required to pull the trigger again and again. He was a man who had been hollowed out by war and refilled with a cold, tactical necessity. Thaddeus, on the other hand, was the parasite. He fed off Gary's strength, using the violence to bolster his own failing sense of self. He was the one who would count the money, his hands shaking not with guilt, but with the adrenaline of the crime. During the Jackson massacre, it was Thaddeus who rifled through the pockets of the dead, his greed a thin, pathetic shield against the enormity of what they had done. They were a closed loop of depravity, each brother reinforcing the other's worst instincts, creating a momentum that was becoming increasingly difficult to stop. The more they killed, the more they felt they were entitled to kill. The atmosphere of Ohio during this time was one of escalating dread. Every news report of another execution-style slaying added another layer of ice to the heart of the community. People began to realize that there was no pattern they could avoid, no behavior that would guarantee their safety. You didn't have to be a criminal to be targeted. You just had to be there. The randomness was the most terrifying part. It could be the woman at the bar, the family at the dinner table, or the kid behind the counter. The incident section of the Luynden story is not just a list of crimes. It is a description of a state being held hostage by two men who had discovered that a small-caliber bullet and a homemade silencer could grant them a terrifying, godlike power. They were rewriting the rules of life in the Midwest, replacing the trust of the neighborhood with the paranoia of the prey. By the time the spree reached its 10th victim, the brothers had become incredibly arrogant. They believed they were invisible because, in a way, they were. They were the men you saw every day and never truly noticed. This arrogance was reflected in the way they began to take more risks, entering homes and stores with less regard for being seen. They had come to believe that the silence of their weapon was a cloak that would protect them forever. But every incident, no matter how cleanly executed, left a psychic mark on the state. The blood on the floor of the Jackson dining room, the empty gaze of the convenience store clerks, the silent tears of the families left behind, all of it was building toward a tipping point. The brothers were leaving a trail of broken lives that would eventually cry out for justice, a chorus of voices that would drown out the quiet pop of their .22. The incidents themselves were brief, seconds of violence followed by years of grief, but their impact was permanent. The way Gary Loingdon would stand over a victim, his face devoid of emotion, his hand as steady as a mountain, is an image of pure, distilled evil. There was no heat in his crimes, no passion, just the cold, efficient application of a skill he had learned in a different world. He had brought the kill zone of the jungle to the quiet streets of Ohio, and in doing so, he had created a nightmare that the state would never truly forget. As the year-long spree continued, the brothers moved like sharks through the dark waters of the Midwest, their hunger growing with every life they consumed. They were the architects of a year of terror, a year where the simple act of sitting down to dinner or working a night shift could result in a final, muffled encounter with the .22 caliber killers. The horror wasn't just in the death, it was in the absolute, chilling ease with which it was delivered. The Loingdon brothers didn't just kill people, they erased them, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any gunshot. This was the incident, a dark, repetitive symphony of loss that transformed the heart of Ohio into a place of shadows and fear, where the only thing more dangerous than the dark was the man who knew how to move through it without making a sound. The first light of dawn on the morning after a murder is often the cruelest witness. It doesn't arrive with a fanfare. It simply bleeds gray and cold over the horizon, illuminating things that were never meant to be seen. When the discovery of the Jackson family finally occurred, it wasn't sparked by a scream or a neighbor's frantic call, but by the oppressive, unnatural silence that had begun to leak out from the cracks of the house on No Bixby Road. To the outside world, the residence remained a picture of Midwestern holiday stability. The wreath on the door was still straight, the frost on the windows was undisturbed, and the Christmas lights, though dark in the daylight, promised a return to festive cheer. But inside, the air had turned heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the stagnant chill of a heater that seemed to be fighting a losing battle against the encroaching void. When the first person finally crossed that threshold, perhaps a relative concerned by a missed phone call or a neighbor noticing the milk still sitting on the porch, they didn't walk into a scene of chaotic struggle. They walked into a still life of absolute, clinical devastation. The dining room was where the narrative of the Jackson family had been abruptly and violently severed. The table was still set, a silent testament to a meal that had been interrupted by the arrival of a phantom. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, and no signs that Robert, Christine, or Beulah had ever had a chance to stand and defend themselves. They were found in their seats, their bodies slumped with a grotesque, marionette-like finality. Robert Jackson, the pillar of the household, was bowed over his plate, his strong hands resting near his cutlery as if he were merely pausing in prayer. Christine was tilted to the side, her expression one of frozen, mid-sentence confusion. And Beulah, the grandmother who had survived so much of the century's hardships, sat at the head of the table, her gaze fixed on a point in space that no living person could see. The blood was not a spray. It was a slow, dark pooling that had saturated the carpet and begun to dry into a deep, obsidian crust. This was the discovery, the moment when the theoretical danger of the .22 caliber killers became a visceral, suffocating reality for the state of Ohio. When the detectives arrived, they moved through the house with a gingerly, reverent sort of horror. They were men used to the messy violence of the streets, the jagged results of bar fights, or the frenzied carnage of crimes of passion. But this was different. This was professional. As they knelt beside the victims, the first thing they noticed was the lack of trauma. There were no bruises, no defensive wounds on the hands, no signs of a struggle. Then they saw the holes. At the temple or the base of the skull, there were small, neat punctures, barely wider than a pencil eraser. They were so clean they almost looked surgical, surrounded by a faint, bruised halo of thermal damage. There was very little exit trauma because the .22 caliber round is a deceptive little killer. It enters with enough force to penetrate bone but lacks the kinetic energy to leave, instead opting to ricochet within the cranial vault until its energy is spent. It was an executioner's choice of ammunition, and it told the investigators immediately that they weren't looking for a panicked amateur. They were looking for someone who understood the anatomy of a kill. The forensic team began their meticulous crawl through the house, but the more they looked, the less they found. There were no shell casings to be found on the floor. Gary Loingdon's military discipline had ensured that he collected his brass, leaving nothing for the ballistics experts to trace back to a specific firing pin. There were no fingerprints on the doorknobs or the silverware. The killers had moved like shadows, touching nothing they didn't have to. The lack of evidence was, in itself, a chilling piece of evidence. It suggested a level of premeditation and fieldcraft that was utterly alien to the quiet suburbs of Columbus. The investigators stood in the center of the dining room, the ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound in the house, feeling the weight of a predator that knew exactly how to vanish. This wasn't a robbery that went wrong. It was a mission that had been successfully completed. The small amount of money missing from the bedrooms felt like an afterthought, a pathetic excuse for the systematic erasure of 3 generations of a single family. The news of the Jackson massacre hit the community like a physical blow. As the black coroner's vans backed up to the curb and the stretchers were wheeled out under the watchful, terrified eyes of the neighborhood, the atmosphere in Ohio shifted irrevocably. This wasn't like the earlier deaths of Joyce Vermillion and Karen Dodrell in Newark, which some had tried to dismiss as a tragic consequence of wrong place, wrong time in the nightlife scene. This was an invasion of the home. It was the realization that the doors you locked and the walls you built were no longer enough to keep the darkness out. In the following days, the discovery of other, smaller scenes began to paint a larger, more terrifying picture. Reports came in of lone gas station attendants found slumped behind their registers in the early morning hours, their bodies discovered by truck drivers looking for coffee. These scenes shared the same DNA as the Jackson house, the same small, neat entry wounds, the same lack of casings, and the same chilling absence of a struggle. The discovery phase was no longer about individual crimes. It was the discovery of a pattern, a quiet, rhythmic pulse of death that was heartbeat steady and cold as ice. In the local police precincts, the maps on the walls began to fill with pins, each one representing a life extinguished by a weapon no one had heard. Detectives sat in rooms blue with cigarette smoke, staring at crime scene photos and trying to find the connective tissue between a grandmother at her dinner table and a 20-year-old clerk at a Sunoco station. There was no common denominator in the victims. No shared social circles, no debts to the same bookie, no hidden scandals. The only thing they shared was their vulnerability and the fact that they had encountered the same ghost. The ballistics reports eventually confirmed the worst. The rifling marks on the lead fragments recovered from the victims all pointed toward a single .22 caliber barrel. It was a serial spree, a campaign of terror that was as random as it was precise. The investigators began to refer to the perpetrator in the singular, not yet realizing they were chasing a duo. They imagined a lone, calculated predator, a man who lived in the silence between the shots. The psychological impact on the investigators themselves during this period cannot be overstated. They were the ones who had to look into the eyes of the families, who had to explain that they had no suspects, no witnesses, and no leads. They were the ones who walked through the Jackson house and saw the half-wrapped Christmas presents in the closet, the ones that would never be opened. This emotional weight began to manifest in a frantic, almost desperate pace of investigation. Every lead was chased until it bled out. Every local tough guy or known robber was hauled in and interrogated until their alibis were airtight. But the Loingdon brothers remained invisible. They were the men delivering the mail, the men sitting in the back of the diners, the men who looked exactly like the people the police were sworn to protect. The discovery of their crimes had led to a dead end, a void where the evidence should have been. It was as if the killer were a part of the landscape itself, a shadow that moved when you turned your head. As the winter deepened, the discovery of the bodies became a grim ritual. Each new scene was a carbon copy of the last, a testament to Gary's unwavering method. The show, Don't Tell, of the crime scenes was a masterclass in nihilism. To walk into a store and find a man dead behind the counter, with the cash drawer still half open and his hand still reaching for a pack of cigarettes, was to see the absolute interruption of a life. There was no poetry in these deaths, no grand statement. There was only the pop of the .22 and the silence that followed. The discovery of the victims' stories, the lives they had led before the pop, only served to sharpen the pain of the investigators. They learned about the hobbies of the clerks, the dreams of the women in Newark, and the long, honorable life of Beulah Jackson. These details didn't help solve the case, but they made the failure to solve it feel like an open wound. The community's response to these discoveries was a mixture of panic and a strange, defensive withdrawal. Gun stores in central Ohio saw a surge in sales. People who had never owned a firearm were suddenly looking for the very same .22 caliber pistols that were being used to hunt them, believing that fighting fire with fire was the only way to survive. The discovery had stripped away the illusion of safety, leaving the public raw and paranoid. Every car that lingered too long on a street, every stranger who asked for directions, was a potential threat. The state was in a state of siege, not from an invading army, but from a phantom that could be anywhere. The police department's switchboards were overwhelmed with tips that led nowhere, shadows seen in backyards, strange noises in the night, neighbors who just didn't look right. The investigation was drowning in the noise of a terrified public, while the actual killers remained in the quiet, sorting mail and counting their meager winnings. The forensic discovery that eventually began to turn the tide was not a fingerprint or a witness statement, but a realization about the nature of the silencer itself. The ballistics experts began to notice a slight, unusual deformity in the lead of the bullets, a wipe mark that suggested the projectile was passing through some kind of material before exiting the barrel. This was the first hint of the homemade suppressor. It told the detectives that their killer was a tinkerer, someone with enough mechanical knowledge to understand how to dampen the sound of a gunshot without completely ruining the accuracy of the weapon. It was a small detail, a microscopic scratch on a piece of lead, but it was the first crack in the Lewington's armor. It suggested a profile. Someone with a garage, someone with tools, and someone with the patience to build a machine of death. But in the vast, industrial landscape of Ohio, that profile fit thousands of men. The discovery section of the Lewington story is a study in the frustration of the law when faced with a lack of motive. Most murders have a why: jealousy, revenge, a drug debt gone wrong. But the .22 caliber killers were killing for sums of money that wouldn't cover a car payment. The lack of a logical why made the who almost impossible to find. The detectives were looking for a criminal mastermind or a raving lunatic, not a postal worker and his brother, who were just trying to stay ahead of the bills. The discovery of the victims was like looking at a series of pages torn from a book. The detectives had the ending of the story, but they couldn't find the beginning or the middle. They were staring at the aftermath of a war that Gary Lewington was still fighting in his head, a war where the civilians of Ohio were the enemy and the .22 was his only friend. As we look back at those crime scenes, the Jackson dining room, the cold parking lots, the lonely gas stations, we see more than just evidence. We see the points where the light of a community was extinguished. The discovery of the bodies was the start of a collective grief that would take years to heal. It was the moment when Ohio lost its innocence, replaced by a wary, sidelong glance at every stranger. The investigators, haunted by what they had seen, continued to push forward, driven by the images of Robert, Christine, and Beulah. They didn't have a name yet, and they didn't have a face, but they had the silence. And in that silence, they would eventually find the tiny, overlooked mistake that would bring the Lewington brothers out of the shadows and into the light of justice. But for now, in the winter of 1978, the state remained a landscape of discovery and dread, waiting for the next pop to signal another life gone, another scene to be processed, and another family to be mourned. The silence was the only thing the killers had left behind, and it was the loudest thing in the room. The air inside the Columbus Police Department headquarters in the early months of 1979 was thick with more than just the usual haze of Lucky Strike smoke and the smell of scorched percolator coffee. It was a heavy, stagnant atmosphere of collective failure that seemed to coat the walls like soot. For over a year, the investigators had been chasing a ghost that left no fingerprints, no shell casings, and no discernible motive. The pressure from the state capitol and the increasingly hysterical public had reached a fever pitch. Every morning, the detectives would walk past a wall of maps pinned with red markers, each one representing a life snuffed out by the silent .22 caliber pistol. They were looking for a monster that fit the profiles, perhaps a wandering drifter, a professional hitman from the Chicago syndicates, or a local psychopath with a grudge against the world. They were looking for anyone who stood out, anyone who looked like they belonged in the dark. They were not looking for the man who delivered their mail or the quiet brother struggling with his bills. This fundamental disconnect between the horror of the crimes and the banality of the killers created a vacuum that the investigation was desperately and unsuccessfully trying to fill. Into this vacuum stepped one of the most tragic and baffling figures in the entire saga, a woman named Claudia Yasko. At 26 years old, Claudia was a fragmented soul, a woman whose mind was a shifting landscape of delusions and shadows, ravaged by schizophrenia and a desperate, pathological need for attention. When she was brought in for questioning, the detectives didn't see a witness. They saw a potential breakthrough. Claudia began to speak, and what came out of her mouth was a terrifyingly vivid tapestry of blood and violence. She described the crime scenes with a haunting level of detail, the way the light hit the bodies, the position of the victims, the coldness of the air. She claimed to have been there, to have watched the shadow perform its grim work. To the exhausted investigators, this was the miracle they had prayed for. They leaned in, their recorders spinning, as Claudia wove a story that seemed to confirm their every suspicion. She named names, she described the weapons, and she offered a narrative of a cult-like group of killers roaming the Ohio night. The interrogation room became a theater of the absurd. Claudia would rock back and forth, her eyes darting to corners of the room where she claimed to see the spirits of the dead, yet her descriptions of the Jackson house and the Newark parking lot were so uncannily accurate that the police felt they finally had their hands on the pulse of the spree. They didn't stop to consider that a woman obsessed with the news, a woman living in the heart of a terrified community, might have absorbed every scrap of public information and processed it through the distorted lens of her illness. They wanted an ending. They wanted to tell the mothers of Newark and the neighbors on No Bixby Road that the nightmare was over. Based almost entirely on Claudia's fragile, hallucinatory testimony, several people were swept up in a wave of arrests. The headlines trumpeted the breakthrough, and for a few brief, shining days, the state of Ohio breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had a face, and the face was behind bars. However, while Claudia Yasko sat in a cell, trapped in the maze of her own mind, and while the police were patting themselves on the back at press conferences, the real monsters were watching the news from the safety of their own living rooms. Gary and Thaddeus Loingdon must have felt a dark, twisted sense of invincibility as they watched the authorities dismantle their own credibility. To Gary, the veteran of a war where the enemy was often invisible, the sight of the police arresting the wrong people was the ultimate confirmation of his superiority. He saw the sheep turning on one another, led by shepherds who couldn't tell the difference between a predator and a victim. The brothers didn't stop. They didn't go into hiding or wait for the heat to die down. In fact, the arrest of Yasko seemed to embolden them. It was the ultimate green light. If the police thought they had the killers, then any new bodies would be seen as a glitch in the system, or perhaps the work of a copycat. The turning point from hope to humiliation came with the sound of another muffled pop. While Claudia Yasko was under 24-hour surveillance in a psychiatric ward of the jail, another victim was found. It was a convenience store clerk, slumped behind the counter in a pool of blood that was still warm. The entry wound was the same, a small, neat .22 caliber hole at the base of the skull. The casing was missing. The cash drawer was empty. The silence was absolute. When the call came into the precinct, the atmosphere didn't just turn cold, it turned glacial. The detectives looked at the red pin being pushed into the map, and then looked at the file on Claudia Yasko. The realization hit them like a physical blow to the stomach. They had been chasing a phantom born of a broken woman's imagination while the real killer was still out there, moving through the night with a silenced pistol and a heart of stone. The fallout was catastrophic for the department's morale and the public's trust. Claudia Yasko was quietly released, her confession revealed to be nothing more than the tragic byproduct of a fractured psyche. The people she had named, who had been subjected to the glare of public suspicion, were set free, leaving behind a trail of ruined reputations and legal threats. The investigation was back to square one, but it was worse than that. Now, the investigators were haunted not just by the killers, but by their own desperation. They had allowed their desire for a resolution to blind them to the lack of physical evidence connecting Yasko to the crimes. They had ignored the how in favor of a convenient who. The Luington brothers had achieved something even more terrifying than murder. They had made the law look impotent. The search for suspects turned toward the mechanical. Since they couldn't find a motive, the police began to focus on the one thing they knew for certain: the weapon. They visited every gun shop in a 50-mile radius, checking sales records for .22 caliber Rugers and Woodsman pistols. They spoke to gunsmiths about the possibility of homemade silencers, looking for anyone who had purchased the specific materials, baffles, steel wool, threaded tubes, needed to dampen a gunshot. This was a grueling, low-probability task. In a state like Ohio, where hunting and target shooting were a way of life, there were thousands of .22s in circulation. Finding the one used in the murders was like trying to find a specific grain of sand in a desert. They investigated disgruntled former employees, local burglars who used small-caliber weapons, and even members of the military who had recently returned from overseas with a specialty in covert operations. Every lead ended in a brick wall. A suspect would emerge, a man with a history of violence and a collection of firearms, only for his alibi to be verified by a dozen witnesses. A tip would come in about a strange man seen loitering near a crime scene, but the description was always too vague. White male, medium height, dark coat. It was a description of half the population of Columbus. The investigation was drowning in the mundane. The brothers were so ordinary that they were effectively invisible. Gary Luington continued to drive his postal route, his blue truck a symbol of government reliability, as he passed police cruisers and detectives on their way to the latest dead end. He was the man in the window who never looked suspicious because he was always supposed to be there. As the months dragged on into the spring of 1979, the detectives began to spiral into a state of professional nihilism. They would sit in the evidence locker, staring at the lead fragments recovered from the Jacksons and the clerks, wondering how something so small could cause so much devastation. They analyzed the wipe marks on the bullets again and again, confirming that a silencer was being used, but the silencer itself remained a mystery. It wasn't a commercial model, it was a bespoke instrument of death, crafted by someone with a garage and a grudge. The psychological profile of the killer was updated. He was patient, he was technically proficient, and he had no criminal record that would put him on their radar. He was a clean killer. The investigators were essentially trying to find a ghost who worked a 9 to 5 job. The psychological toll on the victims' families during this period of NGO cut, the dead end, was unbearable. They had seen the arrests, they had felt the brief surge of hope that justice was coming, only to have it snatched away. The release of Yasko and the continuation of the killings made them feel as though the state had abandoned them. They stopped calling the police for updates because there were no updates to give. The silence of the .22 was now mirrored by the silence of the investigation. The brothers, meanwhile, were refining their synergy. Thaddeus was no longer just a nervous tag-along. He was becoming a willing participant in the game. They would talk about the police's failures with a dark, mocking humor, feeling like they were characters in a movie where they were the only ones who knew the ending. The investigation's failure was not due to a lack of effort, but a lack of imagination. The authorities were looking for a criminal, a word that implies a certain set of behaviors, associations, and histories. They weren't prepared for the citizen killer. They weren't prepared for the man who paid his taxes, mowed his lawn, and murdered 3 generations of a family before going to bed. The Claudia Yasko incident had burned them so badly that they became hesitant, second-guessing every new lead, afraid of another public embarrassment. This hesitation was exactly what the Luyndens needed. They flourished in the gap between the police's fear of failure and their own lack of conscience. The investigation had become a slow-motion car crash, with the detectives watching the bodies pile up and knowing they were powerless to stop it. The suspects and dead ends phase of the Luynden case is a masterclass in how serial killers can hide in the open. It highlights the fragility of forensic science in an era before DNA and digital surveillance. It shows how a single, mentally ill woman could derail a multi-jurisdictional manhunt simply because she gave the police what they wanted to hear. But most of all, it illustrates the sheer, terrifying banality of Gary and Thaddeus. They were the background noise of Ohio, the static on the radio, the shadow on the sidewalk. They were nothing, and because they were nothing, they were everything. As the sun began to warm the Ohio plains and the snow finally melted away, the blood was still fresh on the hands of the postal worker and his brother. The investigation was cold, the leads were gone, and the .22 was being cleaned for its next outing. The breakthrough wouldn't come from a brilliant detective or a high-tech lab. It would come from the one thing Gary Luynden couldn't control, his own growing sense of godlike invincibility. It would come from a piece of plastic and a moment of mundane greed. But until that moment, the state of Ohio remained a dark, uncertain place where the only thing you could count on was the silence of the night and the pop that followed it. The hubris of the serial killer is a peculiar and recurring phenomenon in the annals of true crime, a psychological blind spot that develops when the predator begins to believe that the silence of their crimes is a reflection of their own divinity rather than the simple luck of the draw. For over a year, Gary Luynden had operated as a ghost in the machine of Ohio, a man whose military-grade discipline and homemade silencer had rendered the law impotent and the public paralyzed. He had watched the police chase the hallucinations of a broken woman, and he had seen his own face in the mirror every morning, unmasked, unremarkable, and utterly free. This sense of invincibility did not manifest as a grand, theatrical gesture. It showed itself in a growing carelessness, a loosening of the very tactical knots that had kept him safe. Gary had begun to view the world not as a tactical environment to be navigated, but as a buffet of convenience. He had stopped seeing the stolen items from his victims as radioactive evidence and started seeing them as currency. It was this shift from the cold, calculating soldier to the arrogant, petty thief that would finally provide the crack in the armor that a year of forensic investigation could not find. The breakthrough did not happen in a high-tech laboratory or through a brilliant stroke of detective work. It happened at a checkout counter in a mundane department store in Columbus. It was early 1979, and the spring air was beginning to thaw the frozen ground that had held so many secrets during the winter. Gary Luynden walked into the store with the casual confidence of a man who belonged there. He wasn't wearing his postal uniform, but he carried the same aura of invisibility that had served him so well on his mail route. He selected a few items, common, everyday goods that spoke to the banality of his life. When he reached the register, he didn't pull out a wad of cash from a convenience store robbery. Instead, he reached into his wallet and produced a piece of plastic, a credit card that had belonged to one of his victims. To Gary, this was a moment of supreme power. He was using the identity of a person he had erased to facilitate his own existence. He likely felt that the card was a trophy, a tangible symbol of his victory over the sheep of the world. He didn't consider that while he could silence a human being with a .22, he could not silence the electronic paper trail of a modern financial institution. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman whose name has been lost to the broader headlines, but in the microhistory of the Luynden case, she was the pivot point upon which justice finally turned. She wasn't a detective or a hero. She was simply a diligent employee who had been trained to check the hot list, a physical or early electronic log of stolen credit cards that was updated with grim regularity in an era of rising crime. When Gary handed her the card, she ran the numbers. It was a routine act, a flick of the eyes and a cross-reference of digits. But in that heartbeat, The ghost became a man. The numbers on the card matched a report from a robbery homicide that had been etched into the police department's priority list. She didn't gasp or look up with terrified eyes. She maintained the practiced, bored mask of retail service. She told Gary there was a slight delay with the authorization and stepped away to make a phone call. Gary waited, his hand resting casually on the counter, unaware that the silent pop of his weapon was finally being answered by the rhythmic ringing of a telephone at the police precinct. The response was not a fleet of sirens and a phalanx of SWAT officers. The police had learned the hard way with the Claudia Yasko debacle that rushing into an arrest without a foundation was a recipe for disaster. They sent plainclothes officers, men who blended into the shoppers, their eyes scanning the store for the man who matched the description given by the clerk. When they saw Gary, they didn't see a monster. They saw a middle-aged man in a nondescript jacket, waiting patiently for his purchase. They followed him out to the parking lot, maintaining a discreet distance, watching the way he walked, the way he moved his head, looking for the telltale signs of the predator they had imagined for so long. When they finally moved in, it was quiet and professional. They blocked his car, guns drawn but hidden low, and asked him for his identification. The transition in Gary's eyes from arrogant shopper to trapped animal was instantaneous. The mask of the postal worker slipped, revealing a hollow, cold core that the officers felt in their marrow. They found the stolen credit card in his pocket, a direct link to a dead man, and for the first time in 14 months, the .22 caliber killer had a name. The arrest of Gary Loingdon was only the first domino. As he was being transported to the station, a team of detectives was already descending upon his residence. This was the moment they had dreamed of during those long, smoke-filled nights at the precinct, the chance to step inside the lair of the phantom. The house was exactly what they expected, a shrine to the unremarkable. It was clean, orderly, and smelled of the same mundane life that Gary had projected to the world. But as they moved toward the basement, the atmosphere changed. The basement was Gary's sanctum, a place where the civilian world ended and the soldier's world began. It was a workshop filled with tools, the scent of gun oil, and the metallic tang of shaved steel. In the corner, hidden with a care that spoke of his military training, they found the prize. It was the Ruger .22, the quiet little pistol that had rewrite the history of Ohio in blood. Beside it lay the homemade silencer, a crude but effective pipe-like structure that had turned a suburban home into a munitions factory. The discovery of the weapon was a eureka moment that resonated through the entire department, but it was the secondary finds that truly painted the portrait of the Loingdon brothers. In footlockers and hidden compartments, the police found a grotesque collection of trophies, purses, wallets, jewelry, and personal items belonging to the 10 victims. These weren't items of great value. They were the detritus of lives interrupted. Finding the Jacksons' belongings in Gary's basement was a visceral experience for the detectives who had walked through the blood in the dining room on No Bixby Road. It was the physical manifestation of Gary's nihilism. He hadn't just killed them, he had collected pieces of them to keep in his workshop like spare parts. As the evidence was bagged and tagged, the focus shifted to the second name on the lease, Thaddeus Loingdon. If Gary was the cold, tactical heart of the operation, Thaddeus was the weak link. The police knew that the younger brother, driven by debt and desperation, would be the one to break. Thaddeus was arrested shortly after, his reaction a sharp contrast to Gary's stoic silence. While Gary sat in the interrogation room like a stone statue, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, Thaddeus was a mess of nervous energy and rattling excuses. The breakthrough was now a flood. Under the pressure of the mounting physical evidence, the gun, the silencer, the stolen property, the brothers' partnership began to disintegrate. The police played them against each other, using the classic tactics of the interrogation room. They told Thaddeus that Gary had already pinned the murders on him, that the older brother was going to let the younger one take the fall for the pop of the .22. It didn't take long. Thaddeus started to talk, and the story that emerged was even more chilling than the one the police had imagined. He described the long drives through the night, The way Gary would pick a target with the same casualness someone might use to choose a television program, and the terrifyingly efficient way his brother would execute the mission. The ballistics laboratory provided the final, undeniable confirmation. The microscopic scratches on the lead fragments recovered from the victims were a perfect match for the rifling of the Ruger found in Gary's basement. The wipe marks that had puzzled the investigators for months were explained by the homemade baffles inside the silencer. The science of the law was finally catching up to the silence of the crime. The breakthrough was complete. The police had the men, they had the weapon, and they had the confession. But as the detectives stood in the evidence room, surrounded by the purses of dead women and the jewelry of a murdered grandmother, there was no sense of triumph. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion. They had found the monsters, and they were exactly who they had feared they were, the people next door. The psychological breakthrough for the community was slower and more painful. The news that the man in the blue uniform was one of the killers sent a shockwave of paranoia through the state. If you couldn't trust the man delivering your mail, who could you trust? The breakthrough had solved the mystery, but it had also permanently altered the social contract of Central Ohio. People looked at the everyday workers in their lives with a new, guarded suspicion. The breakthrough wasn't just a legal victory, it was a cultural trauma. The arrest of the Loingdon brothers proved that the most dangerous predators don't always lurk in the woods. Sometimes, they're the ones who have the key to your mailbox and the schedule of your daily life. Gary's mistake, the use of that stolen credit card, was a moment of profound stupidity, but it was also a moment of cosmic justice. His own arrogance, the belief that he was above the rules of the society he moved through, was the very thing that shackled him. As the case moved toward trial, the breakthrough allowed the families of the victims to finally begin the long, agonizing process of seeking closure. They no longer had to wonder who had stepped into their homes or who had met their loved ones in the parking lot. They had faces now, and they had names. They could direct their grief and their anger toward a specific target. For the detectives, the breakthrough was a vindication of their persistence, a reminder that even the most calculated silence will eventually find a voice. The .22 caliber rounds had been small, and the silencer had been effective, but the electronic pulse of a credit card transaction had been louder than any gunshot. It was a modern solution to an ancient kind of evil. The breakthrough section of the Loingdon story serves as a reminder that the perfect crime is a myth fueled by the killer's own ego. No matter how much military training someone has, no matter how quiet their weapon is, they are still a human being subject to the same flaws of greed, pride, and carelessness as anyone else. Gary Loingdon thought he was a soldier in a private war, but in the end, he was just a thief who got caught with a stolen card. The image of the postal worker being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of cold indifference, is the ultimate show, don't tell, of the banality of evil. The silence was over. The investigation was closed. The state of Ohio could finally stop holding its breath, even if the air now felt a little colder and the shadows a little deeper than they had before. The breakthrough had brought the monsters into the light, and the light was unforgiving. It showed two men who had traded 10 lives for a few $100s and the fleeting, pathetic thrill of a quiet trigger pull. As the sun set on the day of the arrest, the quiet pop of the .22 was replaced by the heavy, echoing slam of a cell door, a sound that would define the rest of the Loingdon brothers' lives. The hunt was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. In the final analysis, the breakthrough was a testament to the power of the mundane. It wasn't a car chase or a shootout. It was a signature on a receipt. It was the diligence of a clerk and the patience of a police officer. It was the way the system, for all its flaws and failures during the Yasco incident, eventually ground its way toward the truth. The Loingdon brothers had tried to operate outside that system, to create their own rules of life and death, but the system had a longer memory and a wider reach than they had anticipated. The breakthrough was the moment the world of the victims and the world of the killers finally collided in a way that couldn't be ignored. It was the end of the mystery and the start of the justice. And as the evidence was locked away for trial, the people of Ohio began the slow work of rebuilding the trust that the .22 caliber killers had tried so hard to destroy. They would never be the same, But at least now, they knew the name of the darkness that had moved among them. They knew that the man who delivered the mail was no longer a ghost, but a prisoner, and that the silence of the winter was finally, mercifully, over. The hallway of the Franklin County Courthouse was a corridor of expectant, heavy silence that spring morning, a stark contrast to the media circus that had gathered on the stone steps outside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old paper, the kind of institutional atmosphere that hummed with the slow, grinding gears of the American legal system. When Gary and Thaddeus Loingdon were led into the courtroom, the change in their stature was the first thing everyone noticed. Gone was the phantom-like aura of the .22 caliber killers, the invisible gods of the Ohio night who had decided the fate of 10 souls with a muffled snap of a trigger. In their place stood two men who looked smaller, more frayed, and jarringly ordinary. Gary, the veteran of 1,000 mail deliveries and a brutal jungle war, wore a suit that seemed too large for his frame, his face still set in that terrifying, porcelain mask of indifference. Thaddeus walked behind him, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into his own skin, his eyes avoiding the gaze of the dozens of people packed into the wooden gallery. This was no longer a hunting ground. It was a theater of reckoning, and for the first time in over a year, the predators were the ones being watched. The prosecution began the proceedings not with a roar, but with a meticulous, bone-chilling presentation of the mundane. They didn't need to use flowery language to describe the horror. They let the physical objects on the evidence table speak for themselves. There, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, was the Ruger .22 pistol. It looked almost like a toy, small and unassuming, but beside it lay the homemade silencer, a crude, black-painted pipe that had served as the brothers' cloak of invisibility. The lead prosecutor picked it up with gloved hands, turning it slowly so the jury could see the craftsmanship of a man who had brought the mechanics of war into the peace of a suburban garage. He described the wipe marks on the bullets, the way Gary had engineered the weapon to not just kill, but to erase the sound of the killing. The technicality of the evidence was a slow-motion car crash for the defense. Every ballistic report, every microscopic scratch on a lead fragment recovered from the skull of a victim was a nail being driven into the coffin of their freedom. The science of the law was finally catching up to the silence of the crime, and the pop that no one heard was now echoing through the room with the force of a thunderclap. The gallery was a sea of grief, a collective of families who had been waiting for months to look into the eyes of the men who had shattered their worlds. The Jackson family relatives sat in the front row, their faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from a tragedy that makes no sense. They watched as the prosecution displayed the trophies recovered from Gary's basement. There was a collective gasp, a sharp intake of breath that felt like the room was losing oxygen, as a small, worn wallet and a piece of jewelry belonging to the Jacksons were held up as evidence. These were not items of value. They were the intimate debris of a life interrupted. To see Robert Jackson's wallet on a sterile evidence table was to see the absolute violation of the home. The prosecutor didn't have to say that Gary was a monster. He only had to show the jury that the man in the suit had kept a dead man's credit card in his pocket like a lucky charm. The cruelty wasn't in the violence alone, but in the casual, petty theft that followed it. The contrast between the lives of the victims, hard-working, decent, family-oriented people, and the brothers' motive of paying off cheap debts was a chasm of nihilism that the jury found impossible to bridge. As the trial progressed, the psychological divide between the two brothers became the centerpiece of the courtroom drama. Gary remained a stone statue, his military discipline serving him one last time as he stared at a fixed point on the wall, refusing to acknowledge the victims' families or the evidence that was stripping his life away. He was the commander to the end, a man who had decided that if he was going to fall, he would do so without a single crack in his armor. But Thaddeus was a different story. The younger brother was unraveling in real time. His hands were a restless blur of motion, constantly adjusting his tie or picking at his cuticles. When the prosecution read the details of his confession, the way he had followed Gary into those stores, the way he had watched his brother fire into the heads of teenagers and grandmothers, Thaddeus's head sank lower and lower until his chin almost touched his chest. The Brotherhood of Blood had become a weight he could no longer carry. The younger brother's betrayal was the final piece of the puzzle. Hearing how they had planned the murders over coffee, how they had joked about the police's incompetence during the Yasko investigation, turned the jury's disgust into a palpable, vibrating anger. The testimony of the department store clerk was the moment the trial reached its emotional peak. She stood on the witness stand, a young woman who had done nothing more than her job, yet had become the instrument of fate. Her voice was thin but steady as she described the day Gary Loingdon walked up to her register. She spoke about the coldness in his eyes, the way he didn't blink as he handed her the stolen credit card. She described the terrifying minutes she spent on the phone with the police while the killer stood just feet away, oblivious to the fact that his reign was ending. Gary finally broke his gaze from the wall and looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, the courtroom felt the shadow of the predator return. But the clerk didn't flinch. She looked back at him with a quiet, righteous defiance that seemed to strip away the last of his power. In that exchange, the God complex Gary had cultivated in the darkness was exposed for what it was, the delusion of a small man with a quiet gun. When it came time for the closing arguments, the prosecution didn't focus on the numbers or the forensics. They focused on the silence. They asked the jury to imagine the silence of the Jackson dining room, the silence of the parking lot in Newark, and the silence of the gas stations where young men had died for the change in a drawer. They argued that the Loingdon brothers hadn't just committed murder. They had attempted to kill the very idea of safety in Ohio. They had turned every neighbor into a suspect and every night into a threat. The prosecutor pointed at Gary and Thaddeus, calling them the architects of a year of terror, men who had used their ordinary lives as a mask for extraordinary evil. The defense's plea for mercy, based on Gary's war record and Thaddeus's financial desperation, felt hollow and offensive in the face of 10 lives extinguished for less than $1,000. The war was over, the lawyer argued, and Gary hadn't brought it home to protect anyone. He had brought it home to indulge in the thrill of the kill. The jury's deliberation was relatively brief, a reflection of the overwhelming mountain of physical and testimonial evidence. When they returned to the courtroom, the air was so thick with tension it felt as though the walls were closing in. The foreman read the verdicts one by one, a rhythmic litany of guilty that echoed like the shots of the .22. Guilty for Joyce Vermillion. Guilty for Karen Dodrell. Guilty for Robert, Christine, and Beulah Jackson. 10 times the word was spoken, and 10 times a small piece of justice was restored to the state of Ohio. Gary Loingdon didn't flinch as the words hit him. He took the news like a soldier receiving a report of a lost position, with a cold, vacant acceptance. Thaddeus, however, began to weep, a quiet, shuddering sob that was the only sound in the room besides the foreman's voice. It was the sound of a man realizing that the debt he had tried to kill his way out of was now a permanent, lifelong obligation to the state. The sentencing was the final act of the drama. The judge, a man whose face was a map of stern lines and years of witnessing the worst of humanity, leaned forward over his bench. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the defendants. He spoke of the sheer, senseless cruelty of the crimes, the way the brothers had targeted the most vulnerable and the most innocent. He noted that while Ohio's laws at the time would lead to multiple life sentences rather than the death penalty, he would ensure that the brothers would never again see the sun set over the Ohio plains as free men. He sentenced Gary to life after life after life, consecutive terms that made the possibility of parole a mathematical impossibility. He did the same for Thaddeus, acknowledging his cooperation but refusing to mitigate the punishment for a man who had stood by and watched 10 people die for a few crumpled bills. As the judge's gavel struck the wood with a final, echoing crack, the courtroom erupted in a low murmur of relief. The families of the victims held each other, some crying, some simply staring at the floor, finally allowed to let go of the breath they had been holding for over a year. The Loingdon brothers were shackled, the metallic chink of the chains sounding like the closing of a tomb. As they were led out of the side door toward the transport vans that would take them to the state penitentiary, Gary Loingdon looked back one last time. He didn't look at the judge or the lawyers. He looked at the gallery, his eyes meeting those of a relative of one of his victims. There was no apology in that look, no remorse, just the same hollow, predatory stare of the man who had sat in the dark in Newark. And then he was gone, pulled back into the shadows of the prison system where he would spend the next quarter century. The justice served in that Columbus courtroom was as complete as the law would allow, but as the families walked out into the bright spring sunshine, they knew it was a hollow victory. The life sentences wouldn't bring Robert Jackson back to his workshop or Beulah to her kitchen. They wouldn't give Joyce and Karen the decades of friendship they had earned. The justice phase of the story is always the most bittersweet because it highlights the fundamental limitation of human law. It can punish the monster, but it cannot undo the monstrosity. The Loingdon brothers were no longer a threat. Their silenced weapon was now an item in a police evidence locker, and the pop of the .22 would never again haunt the nights of Ohio. But as the people of Columbus and Newark returned to their homes, they did so with the knowledge that the darkness was real, and that it could wear a blue uniform and deliver the mail. The trial was the end of the fear, but it was the beginning of a long, permanent memory of a year when the heart of Ohio was cold, quiet, and deadly. The brothers had wanted power, and they had found it in the silence of their victims, but in the end, the loudest sound in their lives was the slamming of the prison gates, a sound that would never be silenced, and a sound that signaled the end of their story and the return of a fragile, hard-won peace to the land they had tried so hard to bleed dry. The heavy, echoing clang of the prison gates at the Ohio State Penitentiary did more than just signal the beginning of a life sentence for Gary and Thaddeus Loingdon. It acted as a final, jagged period at the end of a sentence that had been written in the blood of 10 innocent people. As the brothers were led into the sprawling, gray labyrinth of the correctional system, the terrifying aura of the .22 caliber killers began its inevitable, slow dissolution. In the eyes of the law and the media, they were no longer the phantoms of the night, but merely two more numbers in a ledger of the damned. Yet, for the people of Ohio, the aftermath was not a simple closing of a book. It was a long, cold winter of the soul that would last for decades, a period of reflection where a state had to grapple with the realization that the most profound evil doesn't always arrive with a scream or a flourish of a cape. Sometimes, it arrives in a blue uniform with a satchel of mail, and sometimes, it lives in the house next door, mowing its lawn and paying its taxes while planning the next erasure of a human life. Thaddeus Loingdon was the first to succumb to the crushing weight of the life they had chosen. Within the sterile, claustrophobic walls of the prison, the dynamic that had fueled their spree, the lethal synergy of Gary's military coldness and Thaddeus's desperate greed, was rendered useless. Without the mission to sustain him, Thaddeus began to wither. The younger brother, who had wept in the courtroom as the reality of his actions finally broke through his shell of denial, found no solace in the gray routine of incarceration. He became a ghost within a house of ghosts, a man haunted not just by the faces of the people he had helped murder, but by the hollow realization that 10 lives had been traded for a handful of crumpled bills and a legacy of absolute shame. By 1989, only a decade after the gavel had fallen, Thaddeus's body gave up on the life his mind had already abandoned. He died quietly, away from the headlines, his passing a mere footnote in the story of the terror he had helped create. There was no public mourning for Thaddeus. His death was simply the removal of a burden from the state's conscience, a silent end for a man who had lived in the shadow of a much darker brother. Gary Loingdon, however, was a different kind of prisoner. He remained the stone-faced soldier until the very end, a man who treated the prison walls as just another theater of operation. He didn't seek forgiveness, and he never offered the families of his victims the mercy of an explanation. For 25 years, Gary lived in the silence he had perfected in the jungles of Vietnam and the basements of Ohio. He was a model prisoner in the most chilling sense of the word, compliant, methodical, and utterly devoid of the emotional fluctuations that define the other inmates. He watched the world change through the flickering light of a communal television, seeing the Cold War end, the rise of the internet, and the slow fading of the era that had produced him. He remained a man of routines, Perhaps still sorting imaginary mail in the quiet hours of the lockdown, his hands steady and his eyes fixed on a horizon that only he could see. When Gary finally died in 2004 of natural causes, he took the secrets of his psyche to the grave. He never revealed the true nature of the thrill he felt when he pulled the trigger of that suppressed .22, leaving psychologists and criminologists to debate whether he was a product of war-induced trauma or a man who had simply found a way to weaponize his own innate nihilism. With Gary's death, the physical lineage of the .22 caliber killers was extinguished, but the shadow they cast over the heartland of America remained as long and dark as ever. The true aftermath of the Loingdon spree was felt most acutely in the quiet streets of Newark and the suburbs of Columbus. The loss of innocence is a phrase often used in true crime, but for Central Ohio, it was a visceral, physical transformation. Before 1977, the Midwest was a place where the social contract was written in the trust of the neighborhood. Doors were left unlocked, keys were left in ignitions, and the man delivering the mail was a symbol of the government's benign presence in your daily life. The Loingdons didn't just kill people, they killed that trust. They proved that the mask of the ordinary could hide a monster, and that the very people sworn to connect us, like a postal worker, could be the ones seeking to disconnect us from life itself. In the years following the trial, the unlocked door became a relic of a forgotten age. People began to look at their neighbors with a new, guarded intensity. The sound of a car idling in the street at night or a muffled pop from a distant firework no longer brought curiosity, but a cold, prickly fear. The state had been taught a lesson it never wanted to learn, that safety is a fragile illusion and that the silence of the night can be a weapon just as deadly as any bullet. The psychological scar on the law enforcement community was equally profound. The Claudia Yasko incident remained a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how the desperation for a resolution can lead to the ultimate betrayal of justice. For years afterward, detectives in the region would double and triple-check every lead, haunted by the memory of the woman whose delusions had allowed the real killers to continue their hunt for months. The failure of the system to recognize the banality of evil in Gary and Thaddeus led to a fundamental shift in how criminal profiles were constructed. Investigators began to look past the obvious suspects, the drifters, the addicts, the known thugs, and started looking at the men with steady jobs and clean records. The Loingdon case was a catalyst for a more professionalized, data-driven approach to serial crime, proving that forensic science and financial tracking were the only tools strong enough to pierce the veil of the citizen killer. The detectives who had walked through the Jackson house never truly recovered. They carried the images of that dining room into their retirements, a private